Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Benjamin Yoder. I'm here today to talk to you guys about the Xeno series. Why I'm here to talk to you today is because I've been playing this franchise for a long time. I started with Xeno Saga back in like 2001 or something like that. And I like this series a bit. I actually don't love it. I'm kind of weird being up here, but I like the people who make the game a lot, so that's kind of a big reason why I'm here. But whenever I talk to people about this franchise, as it's gotten more popularity, as it's showed up in things like Smash Brothers and things like that, everyone seems to get like really confused. And there's this image and like narrative behind the Xeno series that people are like, it's this super complicated thing. It's really hard to get into. You need to know about all this stuff in these old games to appreciate them today. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. And I think part of that problem is that a lot of people who are really passionate about the Xeno series like it because of kind of this overarching narrative of the franchise. So that's like what they get really excited to talk about and things like that. I'm not saying that's not a valid thing to like about the series. I just think that you start getting like prescribed homework of like, you got to go play this one first, then you can play this one, then you'll know what's happening in this one. And I'm just like, that sounds like, to me, that would be like the ultimate turn off of like, I don't want to play this franchise now because you told me 500 hours of stuff I need to do before I can play the video game I want to play. So I'm a big believer that you should just probably play the Xeno game that you're most interested in. So what we're doing today basically is basically going over a quick kind of like top level explanation. Does this one work? Top level explanation of just like what is similar between all these Xeno series the last 20-25 years. And then I'm going to take a brief like breakdown of each of kind of the sub-series within it and then talk about individual games. And the point of today is not to give like deep dives on this game. I'm not going to be up here telling you about the lore, how is Jesus Christ a part of the Xeno Saga universe and things like that. I'm not here to tell you about that today. I'm here to give you like a 2 to 3 minute rundown of each of these series and games and be like, maybe this is the one for you. Maybe. It's basically like video game speed dating. What Xeno game will be your lover? So it's going to be a very simple presentation overall. So just going to move really quick through it. So, but just to kind of give like a overarching view of like what the Xeno series is first and foremost, because I don't know how familiar everybody is in here. So this is a franchise that started in like 1998. And a lot of people don't really know like how these are segmented per se. So just to kind of talk a little bit about how it is, this is like a very rough timeline I made. 1998, you have Xenogears, and then Xenogears done, over. It never comes back basically. Then you have Xeno Saga between the mid-2000s, again, done, over. There are no more Xeno Saga games today. And then Xenoblade Chronicles is basically the modern iteration of the franchise. And each of these things, as much as people may want to believe that they're all connected in a giant universe, I would say, at least today and where the story is, it's more of Easter eggs when they reference these old series. Like, oh, the spaceship in Xenogears is named the same spaceship as one in Xenoblade Chronicles. And it's like a fun little thing. And like, I know some people who work on the Xeno Wiki, and I love that they're going to go write up a whole lore page about that spaceship and why they're connected and why it matters. But for me, as like a normal player of this franchise, I don't think it's like super valuable. So I think for all intents and purposes today, you can look at all these franchises as separate, independent things that exist separately from each other. That could change in the future. Who says? Mario says that it could change in the future, apparently. Yeah, okay, now my mind's all over the place. Let's just move on from that. But what is kind of the consistent through line between these games is basically who made them. So just as a quick, brief history lesson, Xenogears, like I mentioned earlier, was the first game in the series and was released in 1998. And Square, who's now Square Enix today, is the one who both developed it internally and then also published it at that time. So the people who worked on Xenogears, a lot of them are people who came out of like the 16-bit kind of golden era of Super Nintendo Square Enix RPGs, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, a lot of those kind of same faces. And it seemed like, I don't know how true this is, I'm not like super deep into what's going on with the Xenogears series, but the story always was that Xenogears is like a failed pitch for Final Fantasy VII, and then they were like, you can still make this, but we don't want this to be a Final Fantasy game. And then eventually these guys kind of basically left, they made their own company. That company is called Monolith Soft, and they're basically the primary developers of the Xeno game. So while Xenogears isn't necessarily made by Monolith Soft, a lot of the people involved in Xenogears were the people who went on to create Monolith Soft and things like that. So, and then it kind of jumped around from publishers. Namco handled the Xeno Saga series, and Nintendo handles the Xenoblade Chronicles series, but again, like I said, they kind of happen in a timeline. It's not like Xenosaga is like an active thing, other than sometimes they bring one of the main characters back in various like cross-promotional things. So what is connected between them? What is similar between these Xeno games? One, I think all of them have some kind of like universe scale kind of context to them in terms of the events. This is much truer to earlier games, in my opinion. They really kind of build the lore initially as like, we have this big universe, there's going to be all these things happening, and it's not necessarily going to get touched on in the game that much, but we want to build this entire lore book for basically what our series is. And the early games, I think, definitely kind of lean into that a lot. The later games, I think, take a much more conservative approach, where they try to keep universe scale events in mind, but they make it very simple connections between each individual game rather than try to make something, you know, grand from the very beginning kind of thing. Thematically, I think there's a lot of similarities between these games. Not that this is like unique to the Xeno franchise, but I think humankind's like failures, basically all the ways humans kind of mess up and screw themselves over, is basically kind of the core themes of a lot of the Xeno games. I think it's not so much that Xeno tells it differently than the people, but I think it's the density. There's just a lot more of these themes kind of shoved into one game versus other RPGs and things like that. The thing I care about most, I am more of a Monolith Soft fan than I am a Xeno fan, honestly. But I love their battle mechanics. Basically, a lot of their games have what I like to call like a layered battle system that kind of creates a ladder, where it's like, we introduce some new mechanic, and there's another mechanic that kind of integrates in it, and they all kind of like interconnect with each other, and they go down this you know, every mechanic kind of like feeds into another. And so you get it as a battle system that's very reactive, because you don't necessarily have control of all these mechanics, and you can't line them up perfectly unless you like, there are definitely people who go out of their way to like create, you know, perfect combos and things like that. But I think as a casual player, it's more about being reactionary to the different, how different mechanics are kind of interacting with each other, and using that to like deal the most damage and things like that. So I really like that part about it. And last but not least, the people who make this series really like giant robots. It's actually kind of interesting, because the giant robots are integrated in all different sorts of ways in this series. Some of them you're piloting them. Other ones it's like you're gonna fight them. Other ones it's like there's a giant god that's basically a giant robot, and you walk around on their bodies and stuff. So each game's like relationship with giant robots is different, which is kind of interesting. And I'm actually not a huge fan of the giant robot stuff in these games. I think it's fine. So I'm not gonna talk about that too much today. So if you're here like, man, I'm the biggest Gundam fan and I really wanna know about the robots in Xeno, I will probably not cover that too much today. So anyways, so yeah, that's kind of like the common theme between them. Now, before we get into this, to add on to our technical problems, I'm also having PowerPoint not cooperate with me today, and the videos in the PowerPoint slides not playing nice. So what's going to happen is I'm going to close out this PowerPoint. We're going to go to File Explorer and open the MP4 file and watch these trailers that way. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a trailer on screen, and I'm just going to kind of give you like some key points about each of these games, basically, and you can kind of get a visual look at it, and then I can give you kind of a summary of what I think is stand out about these. But yeah, Xenogears, you know, Xenogears is the initial game, like I mentioned earlier. There's only one game in this series, as far as I'm aware, at the very least. Sometimes it's like, oh, there's a mobile game or something like that on Nokia phones, but I don't think Xenogears has that. That's more of a Xenosaga thing later. Yeah, so the Xenogears games in general, or Xenogears, the one video game, I think kind of the big thing with it is closer to like that Super Nintendo golden era kind of JRPGs. I think when it comes to combat systems, things like that, it's a more traditional turn-based system. I mentioned that layered mechanics thing. I don't think this game has much of that. It's more of a almost like fighting game inspired combat system, where you can put in like a bunch of button combos, and then if you put in a series of combos, eventually you can do like a finishing move kind of thing. My memory is that it was not particularly deep. It just was kind of a cool system to kind of interact with. And eventually there's kind of like these mech battles as well, which operate a little bit differently because you have a fuel gauge with each mech and things like that. So, but from a high level perspective, like this is probably the easiest game to get into combat wise, in my opinion, out of all the franchises. I think it's just really easy to pick up and play. And it has kind of that whole thing where like your little character running around a giant overworld, like old Final Fantasy games on PlayStation and things like that too. But what is kind of distinct about this game from a visual perspective versus Final Fantasy is that it kind of switched the way that they handle polygons. The environments are rendered in 3D, but then the characters are character sprites. And I think that allows a lot of these characters to feel a lot more expressive than a lot of those PlayStation Final Fantasy games, because there's just a lot more detail on these characters and things like that. There is kind of this darker theme, I think, to Xenogears, and to some extent Xenosagas we'll get into later, that these games just feel like they have a darker tone in general. And what I mean by that is, I have a hard time describing this sometimes, but I kind of equate it to like late night animes, 90s, kind of, you know, there's a bit of blood, there's like some casual nudity, things like that throughout the game. Nothing like super obscene or anything like that, but it just kind of has a more adult tone. I think, you know, a company like Square Enix coming out like the Super Nintendo and things like that was trying to aim at like an older audience to some extent, and it feels like this game feels like it was trying to see how far are we willing to push this on this platform. I think Final Fantasy VII kind of has a little bit of that too as well, but anyways. But a lot of people kind of compare it to like Evangelion. I have another video here because this one's short. A lot of people like kind of compare it to Evangelion, which unfortunately I have not watched Evangelion, so I don't even necessarily know what that means. But you know, it has like, can you stand up for me? Turn around. Show your shirt. There's a Furby on a cross. So there's like a part of this game where like there's just like a cross and your mech gets like crucified, and one of the mechs is a giant Furby. So very good shirt. So it has a sense of humor to it, but it definitely does a lot of like religious imagery. You know, it is like a lot of JRPGs. The church is bad, oops, kind of deal, kind of thing, right? That kind of stuff. The one problem with this game, in my opinion, and I think this is a common complaint, is so it's a 2-disc game. You know, PlayStation games, sometimes they have to be on across multiple discs. But what's unique about this game is that when you get to disc 2, the pace of the game changed significantly. So exactly how it got there is one thing or another, but basically, it seems like they basically kind of ran out of time, money, and budget to basically create what they wanted to. And they had to basically do this kind of like highlights thing where it's a lot of text on screen. You're kind of reading the notes of what's going on in the story, and then they'll kind of teleport you to the big event that happens, right? It's like, oh, here's a you know, a giant mech fight, which what's the context? We give you a 1-sentence description before we got into it, kind of thing. But I will say it eventually gets to the point where it tells all its character stories. When it comes to these characters themselves, I feel like the game is very narratively complete. It's just a little compromised. So at the very least with this game, I feel like it is a solid story that you can kind of consume on its own, just be, you know, aware of the pacing change towards the end of the game. They did, after this game come out, put a book called Perfect Works out, and that's kind of where the universe scale event stuff comes into play, where basically this is like episode 5 and like a 6-episode universe story epic kind of thing. I have never read Perfect Works. I don't necessarily know what's going on in there myself, but yeah, I think it's fan translated, right? So, yeah. So, Xenosaga, I'm going to save us some time and just go straight into some gameplay here. Xenosaga is interesting. This is the game, they're primarily on PS2. They're all on PS2, actually. Well, the mainline games. And this is one of those games where it kind of feels like they were looking at that Perfect Works book that they made. It's like this big narrative, universal scale epic, and it kind of feels like they said, what if we made that like an actual video game? And then, so it's supposed to be, I believe, like this 6-part story kind of thing. Whether that is going to be 6 video games or not, I don't necessarily know. But ultimately, it ended up being kind of like 3 video games that came out on this platform. And it is one single narrative between all these video games. So it is not something where it's like, oh, I can jump around and start wherever. I mean, I would love it. Let me know if you play Xenosaga Episode 2 and like have no context for anything. I would love to know the person who did that, and I'd love to hear their thoughts. But really, if you're going to get into the series, it is kind of a go from one to another. But it's very kind of sci-fi oriented. I think it kind of maintains some of those darker themes that I mentioned earlier, where it is a lot more just kind of like more adult-oriented storytelling kind of thing. But I think this game has a little bit of a different change to it, where there's almost like a shock factor to Xenosaga, where there's like a lot of weird body horror stuff that kind of goes on. There's like limbs that get cut off and things like that. And they censor it in the US release. And then a lot of people got like mad at the time. And then it's like, oh, you go look at the Japanese one. They also censored it there. And it's like, okay, well, what really is happening here in terms of censorship? But anyway, so it's got a lot more like moments that feel like they're meant to shock you. And it's like, oh, here's this kind of character that kind of changes into this grotesque thing, but it's still like human enough that it's like, ooh, I don't want to see that kind of thing. And it definitely kind of has that kind of aspect to it. But the original Xenosaga game, I will say, I think it is a well-rounded game mechanically as a video game. This is where it kind of starts getting to that layered battle system stuff I mentioned earlier. So for this game in particular, it has this meter that fills up for each character. And once it fills up, they get the ability to boost. And what boost means is basically they can take the next turn. So you can basically say, no, this character is going next, no matter what the turn order is right now. And how that kind of integrates with the other mechanic of the game is there's this kind of this dial that turns, and that dial has like different buffs and things like that. So it's like critical hit rate up kind of thing. So you can kind of buff a character or boost a character into a turn. And so it's about kind of coordinating, you know, your boosts with those kind of buffs that happen on each of those individual turns and things like that. I do not have another video for this, so we're just going to skip back for a little bit. But I will say, from a narrative perspective, this game is all intro. It feels like they were like, we have all the time in the world to tell this story. And so there's a lot of stuff in this game where they're like, do you remember the thing that happened 5 years ago? That thing at that place? Yes. And then he showed up. And like, they don't give you any information. It's just like, we're telling you something big happened and we're not going to tell you anything about it. And that's most of this game, in my opinion. I recently revisited it. So I'm going to keep moving here real quick. So we're going to drop out of this. Xenosaga, though, I think the first game is totally all right. You just have to be willing to sit through some slow pacing when it comes to narrative. Xenosaga Episode 2 tries to kind of course correct on this. It's a lot faster game, but there's a lot of stuff going on with this game behind the scenes development-wise that kind of make it a weird experience. But it does, you know, oh gosh, I didn't want to skip ahead. What it does do, at least from like a player's perspective, you know, how much it affects the player there. We're just gonna, sorry, you're just gonna get a mouse cursor on screen. You know, it basically tries to speed up the game a little bit more, and I feel like there's a lot more like action cutscenes and things like that. These first two Xeno games in particular are actually really detailed when it comes to their cutscenes, maybe excessively so. But this game kind of has to deal with a similar situation that Xenogears did, where about halfway through the game, they're like, we need to wrap this video game up. And there's like this, you know, so the game starts and you're like sitting around a town, kind of doing some fairly normal stuff. And then there's just like a series of cutscenes like, a war started, oh no. And then you're just like in the war, and then you can go fight a space pope, basically, is what happens. And so it just moves really fast. It's a short game, it's like 15 to 20 hours long. So for RPGs at that time, you know, typically around 50 hours each experience, that's very short overall. But I will say what's really cool about this game, in my opinion, is the battle system. It has that kind of like boost mechanic I was mentioning earlier with the turn buffs and things like that. But additional thing with this game's combat system is each enemy has like a weak point, or a series of weak points, and you have to hit them in certain orders. And so you learn each character's or each enemy's weak point, and then you can use that to kind of combo into these in situations where they're vulnerable, and you can kind of combo other characters into it. So it's kind of overly complicated for a 15-hour video game. And I think that's part of the reason why people don't like the combat system as much here, but it's also kind of slow-paced. So a lot of people kind of feel like the combat in this game just kind of bogs it down. For a game that's already only 15 to 20 hours, it's kind of, yeah, I think there's a lot of reason why people don't like this game. I like it, though. It's good. You should play it. You should really enjoy it. Xenosaga Episode 3. I have mixed feelings on Xenosaga Episode 3, but I think the general sentiment is that this is a good video game. Xenosaga Episode 3 specifically, I think from like a narrative perspective, it's pretty well rounded. It doesn't do any kind of, well, the game kind of starts with a time skip, but I think it's like not as apparent that it's like, oh, it feels more like, oh, we need to wrap this series up. Let's just try to set this game up for the best way for it to tell its story and just kind of finish up. And so I think because of that, and that they knew where they were kind of going with the end of the story, this is the most like well-paced game from a narrative perspective. Everything feels like it is taken care of by the end when it comes to character stories at the very least. There's some more universe scale kind of storytelling that kind of gets not really touched on, but I think given the situation they had, I think ultimately it turned out pretty all right for what they were doing. One thing I haven't really talked about too much, and I want to keep it short with this, but the main character of this series, Xion, she's like a very like weird main character for a video game, because I don't think they tried to make her particularly likable, but she's like incredibly human. And so like she makes all the stupid mistakes humans make. And like if you're watching something from the outside, it's like can be infuriating, especially like I'm playing this as like a teenage boy, so I'm just like, well, I don't understand all these things she's going through. Now I'm a 35-year-old man, I get what Xion's doing a lot more. But she's like a really interesting character, so I like her, but I don't like her. It's very strange. She's just kind of infuriating to watch, but I think she's a really enjoyable character overall in that regard. Combat-wise, they really cut back here. They kind of put it more in line with the first game again. I don't remember. I always had the feeling that it isn't as complicated as the first game, but I don't know how true that is. Again, it's been a long time since I've played these games. But it is just a little bit more simplified. So, you know, especially if you enjoyed Xenosaga Episode 2, it might be a little disappointed, but, you know, it's a perfectly fine video game on its own from that regard. It also kind of has a, I think, smarter use of its budget. So, you know, there's a lot of cutscenes in the earlier games where it's like characters talking and they fully animate these cutscenes even though it's just two characters talking. In these cases, like, we're going to put a character portrait on screen and they're just going to talk. And I'm like, that's probably a smarter way to use your budget and time at this point. So anyways, the Xenosaga series is probably just the most turbulent time in this game's, or the series kind of franchise, or the franchise as a whole. But I think because of its ambition, it's really unique in just like how expansive it feels. Everything about this game just feels like it's trying to do a lot. And there's a lot of like extended media around this game. There's like a cell phone game that didn't get localized and like a PS2 kind of visual novel kind of thing, but it's more like a fan disc thing. I won't get into what a fan disc is right now. I shouldn't have said that. But you know, there's a lot of extended lore kind of stuff going on with this franchise. So I think I think it is worth playing if you're willing to kind of stomach some pacing issues where all these games kind of feel like they're just trying to make something work and maybe only kind of do, but you know, they do a fairly unique thing at the very least. So I kind of wish I had my PowerPoint still open, but we're not going to worry about it right now. That's it. Xenosaga, we're done. Get my Xenosaga notes out of my face right now. Get out of here. Anyways. So this leads us to like where the modern series is now. You got Xenoblade Chronicles, and I'm guessing if you're like, I don't know anything about Xeno, I played a guy in Smash Brothers and it said Xeno by his name, I was like, what is that? This is probably the series you're most familiar with kind of thing. I'll just go and open up this video for this. But yeah, Xenoblade Chronicles is, it's kind of in a lot of ways accidentally a Xeno game. It wasn't originally called Xenoblade, it was called like Monado. And it seems like kind of late in development, they were like, okay, let's make this a Xeno game. But again, same people working on it, and I think a lot of the themes and stuff all feel very similar. So it's not that it's like completely alien from the Xeno franchise or what it used to be, but I think it just feels different. It's got more of a lighter tone to it. I think it feels a lot more in line with like kind of modern Tales games and Final Fantasy games and things like that. And also I think they do a lot to make sure that they don't let their ambition get out of hand here. Basically what they do is they create like one world at a time, and then they make sure that world story is good. We'll worry about the universe stuff at a later point with this stuff, but just make sure the story itself is fine for this series. It is more of an action-oriented series generally, so there's a lot more, it's not like a full-on action game, but it is kind of like that Final Fantasy XIV MMO style gameplay of your character auto-attacks, you use a set of skills, they have cooldowns and things like that. And how the layered mechanics in this franchise works kind of changes per game, but I think a lot of this franchise is about kind of combat buildup, where it's like you're going to use a set of skills to basically build up a meter that will kind of shift you to a different phase of combat, and then that will ultimately kind of pay out in like a high damage combo. And I wish I could go more detail about it today, but we do need to keep moving on this. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think there's a lot of depth here. And I'll talk about one game in particular that I think does a pretty good job like expanding on that a little bit. But the original Xenoblade Chronicles, though, narratively, very complete game because it just doesn't feel like they had any kind of like grander universe in mind. So if you ever want to just play like one Xeno game and feel like story-wise you are good, that's all I need. I don't need to know about any other stuff happening in the Xeno universe. This is probably the game. It also shifted kind of the franchise from more like a traditional JRPG kind of like, you know, dungeon crawling kind of thing where you go in these like little linear dungeons. And it is a more open environment game. It's not open world. It's not like a Skyrim where you can kind of walk anywhere you want in this world, but it's more like, I like to call it like a chain of open environments. So they all kind of connect to each other, but eventually you're going to hit a tunnel and that's going to take you to the next place. And then it's going to open back up. Same deal. There is one exception to this. We'll talk about it today. I will not leave you Xenoblade Chronicles X people out there lacking in that. But yeah. The one thing I will say about Xenoblade Chronicles probably is that it does feel a little dated today, I feel like, as much as I love this game. I think it's just a little slower paced than I think a lot of people expect out of these kind of games these days. There's a lot more time where you're just kind of sitting there staring and waiting for a skill cooldown versus other games. It doesn't always feel like something's happening in combat. And that's also true for exploring the environments, where the environments are like really big. And then so there's a lot of just like downtime where you're just kind of walking with nothing happening. And especially when it comes to the later games, that's just not as much the case. But I will say the one thing that is really cool about this game is I mentioned earlier there's like a subscribe to Nintendo. There is one thing that is cool is that basically this game takes place on giant humanoid gods kind of thing, and so all the people are like living on them. So like the game starts like on his kneecap or something like that. And then so the areas in the game, they look like normal areas. They don't look like you're on a god. But when you think about the structure of them, you know, the like, you know, what's it called? What's that thing where you go up? How much that area goes up or goes down? You know, you can start kind of putting the pieces together, like where you're at on this body and how this area represents that. And I feel like that's something that other games in the franchise try to kind of get, but this is the only one I think that really succeeds in that. One thing that we are going to do today, in addition to talking about these mainline Xenoblade games, is talk about these kind of little mini RPGs. So that you can kind of think of them as DLC for the main games. Some of these are going to be more relevant than others. This one's not so much. So there was an HD remake. I'll show you the Wii version of the game there. There is an HD remake of Xenoblade Chronicles for the Switch. And in that, they included like a little extra bonus chapter. And you can start this without playing the game. I would not really recommend it. It's not really meant to be played on its own in this particular case. But it's like a little bonus RPG thing. And it's like kind of holds one, it's like one area. But all the mechanics of this game are more or less in line with the original Xenoblade Chronicles. It's called Future Connected. I forget if I said the name or not. But for Future Connected specifically, I kind of feel like this is a game that is very, like maybe don't play it right after you finish Xenoblade Chronicles because it's kind of a weird chapter, but maybe if you're like in between Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and playing another game, you're just like, am I in the mood for Xenoblade right now? 10-hour game? I'll play it and do that. Anyways, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I don't think that's a great entry point for the series kind of thing. There is one that is a good entry point we're going to get to, so that's why I'm talking about these DLC packs. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, this is kind of the big one. We're going to get to the spin-offs later, by the way. We're not doing these in chronological order, per se. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is kind of the big one. This is where the franchise kind of got its legs again, finally. A couple million units sold, so not the hugest franchise, but it's doing pretty well. It's a little, I don't know how to put it. It's a little controversial to some extent because it has kind of a lighter tone than a lot of the rest of the franchise, even compared to Xenoblade Chronicles 1. And then a lot of people kind of associate that with the anime kind of character aesthetic as you see going on here. And then so people get kind of worked up about, is it anime or not, which is kind of a silly thing. It's perfectly fine. I think the lighter tone is part of what makes this game its own thing. The main character is just kind of this little goofy kid that doesn't really have too much going on with them. They tried to do some story development with him, but he's just kind of already a good, loving kid from the start. So there's not a lot to really for him to develop with. But it is a really good game overall, I think. But it does have some weirdness to it where I think, I'm surprised this is the game that people got into because there's a lot of weird issues with this game when it comes to, its core philosophy is kind of built around this idea that people are weapons. And then so each weapon gets paired with another person, and that's built into the story of the game, it's built into the combat of the game, it's built into the world exploration, all these things. It's a cool idea. I appreciate that they did it, but it results in some weird situations where there might be like a quest line that you're trying to do, but because this character has a skill required for this quest line, you need to go do this other character's quest to get the skill to finish this quest. So you go to do their quest, but to find out that weapon has a quest that it needs, so you need to go do another quest to do a quest. Oh, actually, the weapon you're trying to use to do that quest, oh, you need another quest to do that, baby. And so it's just this weird chain of events that kind of happen. So it's just a lot of weird minor annoyances, I would say. It's just a lot of weird stuff. Combat-wise, it is probably the most complicated of the series as well, in my opinion. It has kind of this like elemental combo system. I'm not going to go into it. It'd take too long to explain right now. Again, back to the kind of the layered combo thing. But you know, it has a big learning curve though, and I think it takes a long time for people to really get a hang of. And I think the game recognizes that, and it's like 25 hours in, you're still getting like tutorial pop-ups and things like that. And it's not that you can't learn it, I just think it is a little rough if you're like coming in not really knowing anything about this franchise ahead of time. So I'm kind of the belief this game's not like a great entry point. This is a lot of people's entry points, so I've been proven wrong by sales numbers. So one thing narratively, like this, again, this is the kind of the first time they really built a world and then try to connect it back to a previous game. So they try to connect it back to the original Xenoblade Chronicles. But again, it's very light. So if you do play this game on its own, perfectly fine. Don't worry too much about it, kind of thing. Now here's the game that I want to talk about. This is the whole reason why we're talking about DLC in the first place, because I love this video game. So this is a downloadable add-on for Xenoblade Chronicles, but they sold it on its own, maybe recognizing that like, hey, this is a really good standalone game as well. It is a Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torn of the Golden Country. Again, another like 10 to 15 hours experience, but it's a prequel, so you don't really need to know story-wise what's going on in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 for it to work. And I feel like this game cleans up a ton of issues with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And it also really speeds up the tutorial process and things like that. So I know people who bounced off Xenoblade Chronicles 2, played this, were like, oh, I get it now, then go back and play Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and then they're into it kind of thing. So, but yeah, it's like a short little mini RPG, and because of that, I think it's like a great sampler piece. If you're like, I don't have a lot of time, I just want to know if I am interested in these Xenoblade games, I recommend playing this without even playing Xenoblade Chronicles 2 on its own, because it is just 10 to 15 hours, you get a taste of everything Xeno is, or the modern Xeno is, and then you're out. Again, that might not necessarily fit you if you need to invest in a 50 to 70 hour RPG kind of thing. And the other kind of issue with this game is that it is very heavily dependent on you doing side quests at some point, and a lot of people get really frustrated by that, where like you have to do most of the side quests to finish the game. So as long as you're not bothered by that, I would highly, highly recommend this as like a starting point. So Xenoblade Chronicles 3, this is the last of kind of the mainline Xenoblade games. Again, I'm kind of have mixed feelings. 3s do not land well with me in the Xeno series for some reason, so I have mixed feelings on this one. But I think when I think about people who don't know about Xeno, I think it is still a good entry point overall. It is definitely more heavily based on like the lore and story of the past Xenoblade Chronicles games. But the way I kind of contextualize it with people is I say, Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2, in the context of this game, are more of lore devices. They're not directly connected to what's actually happening in this video game. So if you haven't played those games, it's very easy to just like hop into this one and get what you need out of it. Will you be missing some stuff not playing Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2? Probably, but it's nothing really that important in the grand scheme of things. And it also, like mechanically, it's kind of, this whole game is about kind of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and 2 as a game together in a lot of ways. So like mechanically, it has a lot of like similar mechanics between the two games. And I think overall, this game is like a really well-rounded game. Like if you don't want to take my Torna recommendation, like 10 to 15 hours, that's a baby video game. I don't want a baby video game. This video game is, you know, the full kind of 50, well, actually probably close to like 70 to 90 hours kind of in the case of this game. But it is kind of that full-scale RPG, and I think it is just well-rounded. There's not really a lot of pain points in this game, so I think if you're just looking for a high-quality Xeno game to get into, this is like a solid one to jump into kind of thing. And then that brings us to the downloadable content for this game. Again, all these downloadable contents are standalone. This one is maybe not so much from a player perspective at the very least. It's a downloadable content called Future Redeemed. It's a really cool game that unfortunately is like very inaccessible in my opinion, because it is like the series finale, essentially. They're like, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, we let people get in there. We're gonna keep it simple and safe. This one's like, no, 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 no. All the lore matters now. Did you do your 300 hours of homework? Get ready, because otherwise you're probably not going to absorb any of this story really. Which I think is kind of unfortunate, but I get that like they really wanted to kind of like satisfy a lot of the main player base with this, and I think as downloadable content, it makes a lot of sense. But from a gameplay perspective, it is kind of cool because they've been doing these kind of big open environments for all these games, and then this one really condenses them down in a way that I really like. They make these areas really compact, really dense, and they fill it with like a lot of interesting little side quests and things like that, and it doesn't waste a lot of your time. Again, another like 15 to 20 hour kind of RPG thing. And story-wise, when the original characters in this game, I think, are very good characters. One of my favorite characters is this one kid who, I don't know, he has like some kind of communication issue that seems to maybe be related to, I don't know, I don't want to diagnose him as a person, as a fake person, but I think the game does a really good job of like handling how characters interact with them, because his communication issues aren't the problem for him. It's just something they work around kind of thing. So it's like more about understanding of how to communicate with this character rather than being like, hey kid, you don't know how to talk, huh? And that's like every single line against him kind of thing. It's like when you have a fat person in an anime game and they're just like, I love hamburger. And every scene they're just like eating a hamburger and like, wonderful. I'm glad we have the greatest representation in this video game of a fat person. So, all right. So that's kind of the end for the main line. That's kind of where things have cut off. Future Redeemer came out last year, that kind of stuff. But we're going to talk about 2 more video games here real quick, or do I have to get out? Am I good? Okay, I just want to make sure. I thought I had until 3. I want to talk about 2 more video games here real quick. this is kind of the big one, Xenoblade Chronicles X. This is before Xenoblade Chronicles 2 came out, so I think at the time nobody was really sure if this was a spin-off or not. I don't know if Monolith even knew if it was a spin-off or not, but it's a really unique game. And I think the big thing you know about this game is when they did interviews for it, they were like, hey, we want to be the Bethesda of Japan. They're like, we want to make Skyrim basically as a JRPG. And it's very much in that style of like big open world. You can kind of go anywhere you want. You have a create a character, so you're not necessarily following a story of a single character per se. There's definitely characters that are more mainline characters in the story, but and it is all just kind of this big open exploration. The mainline narrative is very limited here, so it's all about kind of world building. And so this game's about crash landing on like an alien planet, and you set up a little building or town, and a bunch of other aliens somehow also ended up on this planet. And then so you kind of like, fight against them, or you befriend them, and they kind of come into your city, and then you get to learn about like all the cultural differences between all these aliens and things like that. So it's a lot more about like world building and community building and stuff like that. And it is a full 100+ hour kind of RPG kind of deal, but it is mostly side content in that regard. You could I don't know what the speed run for this game is, but I feel like it probably is low enough if they could exploit it just to go through, because I think it's like 12 mainline stories and that's it. Throughout the whole thing. But it's a really unique game, and I think it's probably from a Western perspective, this game was on the Wii U, by the way, and it's still only on the Wii U, so it kind of had a limited reach. But I think from a Western perspective, this is probably the game that probably is the most appealing to a more mainstream audience of people who like video games today. It's just in a place that you really can't get to it right now, because I have 2 Wii U's. Did you know I have 2 Wii U's? Most people do not have a Wii U, so yeah. The one thing I will say about this game is that this is kind of them letting their ambition get out of control, but instead of from a narrative perspective, it's more from a content perspective. Like I said, this is a full 100+ hour video game, but everything in this game just feels like slightly compromised. And it feels like they just built way too big of a world, way too big of a design dock, and just couldn't get it done. So there's a lot of weird aspects to this game that just feel underproduced. It also ends on a pretty hard cliffhanger, and we'll see if they kind of follow it up. They talk about it in interviews all the time, so I don't think the game's left their mind. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know what they're going to do with this franchise, because this was a kind of a mess of a game in some ways, but it's still a really good game. It turned out really good. The last game we're going to talk about here doesn't have Xeno in the name. But I think it's worth talking about. Like I mentioned earlier, where Xenoblade Chronicles started out as Monado instead of Xeno, and then kind of became that towards the end of the development. During that kind of post-Xeno saga period, they were seemingly avoiding the Xeno name for a little bit. And one game they made in that time frame was called Somabringer. And this is a Nintendo DS game. Sorry, the beginning of this video has a little bit of compression stuff. This is a Nintendo DS game, but it is still very Xeno in its themes and a lot of its gameplay mechanics. But it is more of a traditional action RPG. So it is actually like a Diablo clone, if anything. It's like isometric viewpoint. You go and you press the button and your character goes over and over and over again. And it is very loot driven. So it's like you're gonna open a chest and be like, oh, here's this leather shirt that has +1 defense, but this one has -2 defense, but +1 strength, and you're gonna pick whatever one you want kind of thing. It's a lot of that kind of stuff of randomized stats, building a character. Your character stats are pretty much free form and stuff like that. And it's also multiplayer, which is kind of a weird thing as well. Xenoblade Chronicles X has multiplayer, but it's like a very side thing in that game, like a leftover aspect of a previous idea. This game is built entirely around multiplayer, but it's local wireless multiplayer. So unless you're gonna get a bunch of friends together with 4 DSs, you might have some trouble. But narratively, they do a lot with this game. It's just very conservative being on the DS. It's not very high production value from cutscene perspective. They try to limit, I think, the number of cutscenes and length of them, probably because it is kind of like drop in, drop out multiplayer. So I think they don't want to keep in cutscenes very long. But because of that, it's kind of refreshing in some ways, where the story points that in a JRPG where it's like 15 hours of a character being like, oh, should I be worrying about this? I don't know. Should I feel bad about this kind of thing? That kind of stuff doesn't exist in this game. It is like, here's a cutscene, here's the character's story point, we're gonna resolve it in the next cutscene, cool, 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 we gotta go. You gotta play video games with your friends, get out of here. Thank you for listening to our story real quick. It was released only in Japan, but it has a fan translation, so you can figure that out for yourself and what you need to do with that. But oh, it's also more fantastical. There's no mechs in this game. Literally no mechs. What the heck, Monolith Soft? Where's the mechs? Where's the robots? Yeah, and that's kind of it. I don't know if I'd recommend someone bring it to like a first timer, but it's a curiosity, interesting curiosity. And I don't think it's like valueless, but I think it is just kind of a tough game to get into, if only because you have to like go and set yourself a fan translation up real quick. So, but just to kind of wrap up here real quick, that's it for our video games. But you know, I just want to kind of emphasize, you know, this is kind of just like a rambling of what video games are in this series. But I think a big thing I just want to emphasize, I'm not going to open up the whole slide, you know, just make sure you pick a game that looks appealing to you. Don't worry about people who are like, you got to play this game in this series. Look, if you want to live your life and play Xenosaga Episode 2 first, I am all for you. It's America. Do what you want. You know, Europe only got Xenosaga Episode 2 and no other Xenosaga game, which is bizarre. Don't worry about the perfect path, because Europeans couldn't worry about a perfect path. Or I'm done talking about Europe. Don't worry about a perfect path, because I think a lot of people will try to, like, again, give you a chart and stuff of where you should go. You know, when you have played the video game you want to play and decided to yourself, I care about Xeno, then think about, hey, what lore am I interested in next? Do I want to know more about Xenoblade? Do I want to learn more about these other games and things like that? At that point, figure it out. But just enjoy some good games. Don't stress about it. I think we stress about video games too much sometimes, especially people in the Xeno community. And I feel bad because I'm a Monolith Soft fan more than anything, so I feel like distant from them in some ways. And I just kind of watch them kind of fight over each other about stuff. But you know, I think it's a cool franchise. I don't love this series as much as I like other Monolith Soft games. If you're really interested in Monolith Soft stuff, check out Baten Kaitos for the GameCube. I'm a big fan of Baten Kaitos. It's a cool game. I'm not going to tell you about that right now, because I'm going to wrap up. But that is it, though. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for listening and waiting as well, because we had all those technical stuff at the start. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know. Oh, I have a YouTube channel, by the way. I don't post as much there anymore. I post something like every 3 to 6 months. Mostly, my point of my YouTube channel is kind of just like, it's weird to say this, but like empathetic about games, trying to understand other people. My last video was a Somabringer video, actually, and a lot of it was me just being like, trying to quell some feelings I had about the Xeno series in a lot of ways. But it's more about like trying to be more open to different fan bases and stuff, and not, you know, everyone likes to make fun of Xeno fans because like there's a lot of like anime tropey stuff in a lot of Xenoblade Chronicles games specifically. I think it's better for us to be more open to those kind of people and things like those kind of people. I didn't mean it like that, but yeah, so that's it for that. So anyways, did anyone have any questions before I wrap up? I don't know if I really left any room for questions per se. I just kind of went, but your arm twitch? Can you make up a question right now? Come on. My favorite Xeno series game? So this is a fun story. My favorite Xeno series game is a mini game in Xenosaga. It's called Hackox, and it's a puzzle game where you like push little Xenosaga characters around, and they like scream when they fall and die. And it's kind of sad because it's a very serious game, and then like these characters are in this little computer game, and they're like screaming as they fall, like ah! But it's really cool. Why I like it so much is because it's a very physical puzzle game, because everything is about, it's like a physics-based puzzle game, and like how you push characters around is not predetermined. So like, there's these blocks that you kind of push, and you can launch characters in the air, you can make them run and they'll jump further, and so they have to like bounce between different blocks. So it's very kind of Lemmings-esque, but like without so many Lemmings. It's like 4 kind of characters. So that's technically my favorite Xeno game, but Torn of the Golden Country of games that have Xeno, a Xeno game, Torn of the Golden Country, my favorite game. Baten Kaitos on the GameCube is probably my favorite Monolith Soft game. My first real Monolith Soft game was a game called Disaster Day of Crisis on the Wii, which is a game about natural disasters, and it's an on-rails shooter, and it's like B-movie. It's like a weird point for me to get into this franchise. Although my dad bought me my first Xeno game, actually, so you can blame him for me being here today. He like sent it to me in the mail, probably just like, there's an anime lady on this box. I know you like anime, so I guess this. But I'm sure you know everything about Xenosaga, and you want to come up here and talk about Xenosaga right now? Okay. So yeah, any other questions? I need to be wrapping up. I need to not just be making small talk. You guys enjoy yourself, enjoy your convention. I'm going camping tomorrow, so goodbye.